Nioh 3 is out on PC and console, and it's using its own engine, and that's something that always makes us pretty happy at Digital Foundry. And today, in a quick look at that PC version, we're going to go through the basics, see how it runs, and to talk about that Katana engine as it runs on PC, I've brought along Tom Morgan for the adventure, who covered this game on console.
Hi Alex. Yes, I've just come hot for the presses from the console coverage of Nioh 3, which will turn out to be a very strange, eclectic beast, full of oddities, but also it turned out to be a great game. So a real sort of odd mixture of great gameplay and strange technology. And I think that carries over to PC as well.
Yeah, basically the user experience on PC is filled with great things and less than great things that come from its technical makeup in that usage of the Katana engine and how they kind of made a PC version here. So I would say, although it may sound controversial based upon the opinions you read about this game online, I think it is actually the best user experience in a Katana engine game to date, or at least in a Nioh title. I would say. I haven't played them all. The only reason why I say that is because it does a lot of things that I expect of good PC ports. At the beginning of it, there's a quick shader compilation step, PSO burn, that was short. It was on a Ryzen 5 3600. It was only 1 minute and 30 seconds long. And it even declared how many shaders there were, like 17,000 or so, which is, that's cool that a title shows you that, the exact number. And based upon everything I could see in the first 2 hours to 3 hours of gameplay, because this is more of like a quick review here, not a full game review, it was effective. I didn't see any large stutters that came when new effects came about.
That's great.
Another thing that I really expect of great PC versions are good graphical options, and they do a good job here actually with a real-time settings menu that runs the game in the background while you're playing it and has the ability to toggle the settings on and off in real time. And when you do it, you can even make the background transparent so you could see those settings changes in real time, which is something I wrote, about years ago in 2023, what I think good PC games should do. And this game is following that trend, and I think it's really good. There's also a lot of options for those graphics, for gameplay, for post-processing. There's even an effective dynamic resolution scaler that I'll talk about it a little bit later, which isn't par for the course on PC, and it worked with the Upscalers FSR, 3.1 DLSS, using 4 DLSS 4K at least there, and then XeSS 2, as well as frame generation. So it does all those things, I would say, good PC ports should do. Though it has its issues, it is doing that nice new graphical menu style that I vastly prefer, but it's also kind of a bit too big and has too many options that are kind of tucked away in submenus. So if you do want to adjust something, it can be a bit irksome to have to go into 5 different submenus to adjust it. Stuff like global illumination, dynamic res, chromatic aberration. They're all in their own little submenus of that graphics menu, which is a bit odd. It's almost like it was designed around someone playing the game from pretty far away with a controller, rather than, because the text is so big, rather than being smaller text, more stuff on a page, and being better navigable with a mouse and keyboard. This is one of those games that I think was designed primarily around a controller, which isn't the worst thing, of course, but it is a little bit less than ideal if you have a mouse and keyboard. Another thing that I noticed is that the Upscalers in the game, there's a couple graphical issues in the game with flickering, but definitely the games water puddles, when there's light reflecting off of them, and there's this refraction effect underneath the water. Yeah, that is pretty noisy on all the Upscalers. So the game does offer those Upscalers and dynamic res, which I think is really cool, but at the same time, it can be a bit noisy.
Yes, so a lot of that sounds very similar to what I had on PS5 and PS5 Pro, the SSR bit especially. Yes, I suppose that's the one bit of insight I can add to this, is that what happens on console relative to what you're saying about the PC situation. Okay, so lots of great options in the menus, but they're quite tricky to kind of navigate with this setup that they've got. And I guess it speaks to how closely Team Ninja work with console traditionally and then use PC after the fact. But it does sound like they're getting better, and I'm looking at your notes here. It seems that you've got a lot of thoughts on what people should do regarding visual quality, and especially you've got a RTX 4060 with a Ryzen 5 3600 as your kind of middle range PC, and it kind of defaulted to a certain setting.
Yeah, basically it defaulted to standard settings at 1440p output with DLSS dynamic resolution on, 50% minimum, 65% max. So that's like between quality and performance mode for DLSS roughly. And those standard settings across the board. When I got into game, there were a few things that I noticed right away. One, cutscenes were at 30 FPS, much like you talked about on console in your review there, Tom. And it all kind of seemed like conservative graphical settings. Especially since dynamic resolution was already engaged, right? But I would say if you kept at those standard settings on a GPU like this one, which is more or less console level, you would be getting a pretty good 60 FPS through most of the game's GPU limited experience, right? But I thought the settings set as they were a bit conservative. Specifically, just like right in the intro, panning the camera, I noticed there was like a flickering on the ground and in between grass blades and whatnot. And this was, I thought it was ambient occlusion, but it's actually tied to the game's GI setting that I think at the game's lower GI settings, the filter, it's like sub-native. It's using some form of tracing that isn't using hardware tracing. And it's not like a per pixel GI, but it's some sort of GI that's tracing, and it's like sub-native. And when you combine that with Upscalers, the game just kind of looks a bit murky, a bit aliased, a bit flickery in those shadow regions if you're using like lower quality levels as we see here. And it only gets really better at that like ultra setting, which costs about 15% performance at the resolution indicated here on the RTX 4060. I think given that you're already kind of scaling res pretty hard in this game, I think it makes sense to get at least a good resolution experience as much as possible, like clarity. So I recommend this to be set to ultra on a modern GPU. Another thing that I found was that the game's terrain setting at the default standard that it defaulted to was a bit overly conservative. It didn't have a great performance difference as we're seeing here, like from standard to what would be ultra quality. It's like the exact same performance in this scene here, but just the moving backwards and forwards with stuff really close to the camera. You could see like the ground morphing right in front of you, which I thought was just a step too far for a game that we're already making larger resolution sacrifices in. So this is another one where I think you should be using the ultra setting. Another thing that Tom talked about, you talked about in your review there, Tom, was the game's screen space reflections. It is not using the ray trace reflections found in other Katana titles, and I think it really shows up in the game's water at times. It's kind of noisy, kind of flickery, and here, I'm not sure if the setting's working completely right, but between Ultra and the standard setting for SSR, it looked pretty similar. A little bit heavier there on Ultra, but nothing that would really matter too much. In the end, you could really run any setting here between standard and Ultra and get a similar visual quality level. So might as well just save a little bit on performance, I feel. And lastly, when I loaded up the game for the first time, I think a lot of people are going to see this when they load it up, especially on mid to low range GPUs that are scaling resolution a bit more. As the game looked on PC at least super deep fried, like really like strong lines, outlines around stuff, like ringing artifacts. The game defaults to a 1.0 sharpness on the sharpness slider.
Right.
And yeah, turn that down to 0 immediately. The game looks so much better for it. Like even in the main character select screen, I was like, oh, this game looks super toasty. But that's about it. And another thing that I recommend people to utilize in this game specifically is, I think since we are turning up the heaviest option in my recommendations here, the GI, that is one of the heaviest options in the game, to Ultra to get the best image quality, I think you should rely on the game's dynamic resolution scaling. It seems like the game's graphical options were designed around a certain level of quality, and then the game would use dynamic resolution. Yeah, the game seems to be designed around using dynamic resolution scaling as its primary kind of like way to adjust performance, and you kind of see that on the consoles in the performance mode. And I think since it is so effective here on PC, you could be looking over an outcrop and be at like quality mode and be below 60, but then using dynamic resolution scaling gets very similar visual quality in that same area, with DLSS, and it will be running much closer to 60. And as far as I can tell on PC using DLSS at least, unlike PSSR on PS5 Pro that Tom talked about, there is no flickering when the resolution changes. It's pretty smooth, and I imagine most people wouldn't even notice it's on. So definitely utilize DRS.
So with all that in place, how was actual performance? What was the payoff? Well, how did it run on the RTX 4060?
Well, when GPU limited on this system with the Ryzen 5 3600 RTX 4060, using those mainly standard settings other than the tweaks I just described earlier, the game would vary between 720p and around like 960p, since that was my maximum resolution target. And it would be hitting 60 FPS most of the time, but there would be moments where it would dip below, like around transparencies, where it could be in the middle 50s or so. And that is actually pretty intense for a game that isn't using real-time, hardware ray tracing. It's performing kind of like a game that is using hardware RT. Like if we look at a game like Star Wars Outlaws or Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, it's performing more like that than a game that is using standard techniques. And you kind of have to ask your question, you question yourself when you're seeing a game run like this. You say like, is this visual quality worth it? And I think that's going to be a subjective thing up to every player. I'm happy that they're using their own engine, but at the same time, I almost wish it was more advanced in some areas. A plus side, though, in comparison to many other games, is that this game's latency at 60 FPS, when I was playing it in a 120 hertz container with VSync on, was like super low.
That's great.
Like way lower than most 60 FPS games. It was in the 20 to 30 millisecond PCL territory, which is really, really good. Like really, really good. And this was all being played with, like I said, vertical sync on and reflex off. And, if you had reflex on in the game by utilizing frame gen, the game might potentially even have lower latency. So I think that's a really great aspect of the game's performance, even on a mid-spec hardware or low-spec CPU like we see here. The problem is probably, for other than heavy GPU performance at these kind of middling settings, is the CPU performance is a bit heavier, but it's definitely not unreasonable or like way worse than many other games, I would say. Like I just showed off a couple weeks ago the Outer Worlds 2 running on this CPU, which is kind of disastrous, like really below 60 the entire time. And here, while CPU limited, pumping down that resolution really low to make it CPU limited, the Ryzen 5 3600 is just like sometimes barely above 60 when running around like the first open terrain area. And it just goes to show that this console like CPU is like the bare minimum for 60 FPS in the game. The frame times are a little wonky when doing that, but nothing the frame cap wouldn't help smooth out. So since it is the bare minimum CPU, I really wouldn't recommend, if you're targeting 60 FPS, to run anything lower than this, like a Steam Deck and whatnot. It just wouldn't hold up at all.
That makes a lot of sense. It does seem like there's a very specific spec that it was targeting. Now, I noticed in your footage that there's some CPU limited footage here, which is now running in slow motion. What's the explanation for that? I'm dreading to think. I think I know the answer, but I want to hear it from your mouth.
Yeah, so the biggest issue with Katana engine games typically, and I don't think this is a default thing that it needs to be, but it is the way it is that they only really run right at certain frame rates or multiples of that frame rate. In this case, I think it's multiples of 30, or maybe multiples of 60, or divisions of 60. Basically, as you're seeing here, the game is running CPU limited with an option turned off called FPS dynamic adjustment option. And I'm targeting 120 FPS because it's a 120 hertz container I'm running it in. And yeah, the game is, when it is below 120 here, it is slow-mo town. Everything's running slow. I mean, if you wanted to play the game in some sort of hardcore way and like get like the best input possible, you could play the game this way, but that is definitely not the way we play games usually. The game basically doesn't support variable frame rates below your target. So if you target 60, and you're below it, and this option is set just the way I described it is, the game will run in slow-mo. But this option is usually actually set on per default, in which case the default behavior of the game is that when it drops frames below the target, maybe 60 or 120 or what have you, then the game's animations skip regardless.
Oh boy.
It kind of performs a bit like a triple buffered VSync presentation with animation skipping. And the reason why this is a problem is because most people these days on PC especially have VRR displays, so they don't usually look to be hitting perfect frame rates. But in this game, the default behavior is that if you are not hitting your fixed frame rate set as set in the options here, then the game will have judder in the camera or in the animations when you are below your target. And so it is unsmooth. The game doesn't support VRR, doesn't support variable animation speed. And if you toggle off that option, like I described earlier, it's interesting that they allow you to toggle it off.
Yeah.
But if you're below your fixed target there, then the game runs in slow motion. And this actually applies to cutscenes to a degree as well. There's a cutscene option there too to make the cutscenes run at 30 or 60. And I set it to 60, for example, on the RTX 4060 just to see what was up. And it's pretty GPU limited below that actually most of the time because the cutscenes are heavier than the game itself. And those times when it's below 60, like in the 40s or 50s, it doesn't slow down, it feels like. Or maybe it does, but the audio no longer lines up with the action.
Join our Lord. I will keep them at bay.
Which is something you don't tend to see in most games anymore.
My God.
Most games have support for variable frame rate and support for variable animation speeds, or divisions of them. Mm-hmm. And this game doesn't support it. So it kind of is programmed more like a game you'd see from like over 25 years ago. And I'd say this is the Katana engines and this game's biggest specific weakness, that you can't run it like a typical variable frame rate game, which is a very common thing to do on PC. You have to be hitting your target of 30, 60, or 120. Otherwise, it won't be smooth. Or if you click that option off, it's in slow motion.
Gee. Well, I didn't expect that, honestly. I guess Souls fans will be very familiar with this. Dark Souls 3 famously had issues with frame rates above 60, I believe, affecting the animations. So I guess Team Ninja are really playing homage to the inspiration for some of their titles anyway. And I suppose, the Team Ninja said they didn't want to offer a different difficulty mode, an easy option, but here we have it. If you run at higher frame rates, you get slow motion and you can beat the game easy. But all right, that sounds like we covered all the bases. Do you have any kind of final thoughts on this one?
So, kind of in spite of what I've been reading online, I do think this is actually kind of okay in a lot of aspects. Like I talked about the menu decisions, the amount of options, the good shader compilation strategy on PC, the reasonable CPU performance in the open world. Like I do think the Ryzen 5 3600 is like a super old bare minimum processor at this point, and even getting near 60 makes me happy. So I can't complain too much about those things. But the kind of rougher areas of Katana and their design decisions there stand out. The lack of variable frame rate support is a really big bummer. It totally limits how you want to play this game on your, PC setup. And I don't think that is very good at all.
No.
And I want to see them iterate on Katana more in the future because I like custom technology. And they've already iterated on it so much. Since the first Nioh port on PC, which was really rough and really basic. This is way better than that. And I think their next step is to really make sure their games support variable frame rate better, either as an option that is toggleable in the menu and actually works, or some other system, because right now I don't think it works.
Well, it does seem like they're very committed to it because, for the last 3-4 years, we've had Rise of the Ronin, Wolong Fallen Dynasty, we've had Stranger of Paradise, we've seen, open world streaming added in Rise of the Ronin in particular, and ray tracing there, R2 Reflections. So it does seem like they haven't succumbed to the temptations of Unreal Engine 5, which is, a real rarity in this day and age, and I kind of applaud it. In fact, I applaud it more than anything. Like, honestly, I love to see this strange sort of like attempts at trying to do what other engines do in their own way, even if it falls short in some ways. So yeah, mixed feelings, but overall, I'm glad that they're trying to have a stab at it with their own technology.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. And Tom, thank you for, once again, asking me some very poignant questions so I can answer them for the audience.
I'm glad we got to the heart of the issue. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and if you did enjoy this short mini review of Nioh 3 as running on a mid to low spec PC, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, help us out on Patreon, follow on social media, and as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.